been a great event, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the many people who helped make this conference possible. Joe Driscoll thanked our sponsors at the very start, but I want to add my appreciation for the investment that they make in our organization. But I also want to thank our board, our volunteers, speakers, and of course, the ADC staff. From the conference program to the Great American Defense Community's activities, awards ceremony, and everything in between, this is a giant undertaking, and it takes a great team working together to make it all happen. I want to specifically thank the ADC communications team who develops all the media that you see at this event, like the magazine, the video, and other materials. This talented team is very skilled at telling the stories of America's defense communities, and now they're available to support our members for a for-service fee basis. From custom magazines to videos or material development, we encourage you to think about ADC as your communications partner, and learn more about this on the ADC website or talk with any of the members of the staff. It's now my pleasure to introduce our final keynote panel for today. Joining us for an exploration of what's next, the trends, politics, and policies that will define the year ahead. Please welcome Frederico Bartels, policy analyst from the Heritage Foundation, Blaise Misztal, Director of National Security from the Bipartisan Policy Center, Mackenzie Eaglen, Resident Fellow, Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies, the American Enterprise Institute, Todd Harrison, Director of Defense Budget Analysis and Senior Fellow, International Security Program, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and our moderator for today's panel, ADC CEO Tim Ford.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to the team who produced that video. It was great. It's great when we have instant videos of our week. So I want to welcome our panel. I think we have a great group here. We purposely didn't do a lot of pre-planning with them so that we can have a really good off-the-record discussion and really dive into a lot of issues. So I think we have a list of about 10 things we're going to get to this morning. So bear with us. This is going to be a fast-paced discussion. I want to start at the budget because everything always comes back to the budget. So, I guess we could start with a question. Is the buildup happening? And are we in it? How long is it going to last? And what do we see on the out years? So Mackenzie's always been my budget person. I'll go to Mackenzie first, and then we'll work our way around the group.
So thanks for having me. It's always fun to be here, and it's fun to return each year. So it's been a banner year for defense spending, and the top line increase was pretty significant. Most significant from 17 to 18, and then of course this year, while Congress is considering the 2019 budget, it's a lot of new money. But there are a couple of challenges, even though there's new money, and I don't mean that it's a bad thing that there are challenges, but the spend rate, OMB is concerned. There's some concern at the White House Budget Office about what's being bought with that new money because it was so large and such short notice, and it's not necessarily translating directly into the priorities, one, that the president campaigned on, or two, that the Secretary of Defense has put out under his new strategy. So there's some trade space there, and they're not capitalizing on the moment, I think, as well as they could be. And secondly is that this is the peak year. So it's rare that when you're in a defense budget buildup, which is different from an actual buildup, which I'll get to quickly before I wrap up, where you're at the apex, where you're at the height of the spending, but we have the long-term budget plans, we have the 5 and 10-year federal plans, and we know that everything pretty much flatlines from here on out with inflation. And I don't expect that to change dramatically, even if Congress were to flip or one chamber of Congress in the midterms. Those trend lines are pretty much set politically, I think. And so if this is the peak year and this is the most we're going to get, the question is it trickling down and creating effects and results? Lastly, while there's a fiscal buildup, it's not necessarily a force structure buildup. So I think there's this perception, starting with candidate Trump on the campaign trail, that more money would translate into something along the lines of like a Reagan-style buildup, 600-ship Navy, more combat-coded aircraft for the Air Force, more vehicles tracked and wheeled for the Army, et cetera, more soldiers. And we're not seeing fundamental shifts along those lines. You see select increases here and there, but the force isn't growing substantially. Congress doesn't want it to, and the increases in terms of capital assets is pretty limited. And so there's a buildup, yes, and there's a buildup, no.
I'll jump down to Fred, and from the heritage perspective, what do you guys see? Are we in the buildup?
So that is a great point that Mackenzie bringing up. What are we building up? And that is the answer that is left. That's the question that is left unanswered. Because the problem, as she mentioned, is not the budget today or next year, but really the plan that you have later on. The Defense Department clearly opted to get all its resources up front and settle for an inflationary growth in the rest of the fight up. So in a sense, that's a smart trade that they did, because you have no idea how the Budget Control Act caps are going to play out in 2020 and 2021 while it's still in play, and you also have no idea how Congress is going to react to that. The interesting thing to do, and the real point that you're going to have an answer to the question of if it's an actual buildup is in the FY20 budget that Shanahan offhandedly called masterpiece. But I think for the amount of questions that that budget is going to have to answer, it's going to have to be a masterpiece. And also the deputy has showed that he wants to present Congress a receipt of what they did with the budget increase. And depending on what receipt they show Congress, you're going to have completely different reactions. So it could be the peak or could not be the peak. It all depends on what they actually present to Congress as their work.
Todd, let's jump your perspective on budget.
Yeah, so we got to remember that this is just a 2-year budget deal. It increased the budget caps for FY18 and FY19. Beyond that, sure, we have the administration's FIDEP, which just shows a plateau in the budget in the future years, just growing with inflation. But we don't have a budget deal that will allow that to happen. So Congress is going to have to come back for FY20 and FY21. The budget caps return to their original level. So it's going to be a drop of about $85 billion. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but Congress still has to come back and pass another budget deal. And you know what? It requires 60 votes in the Senate again. So this has to be a bipartisan deal, which means to get Democratic votes, you got to get, an increase on the non-defense side of the caps. Well, that limits, Republican support. So we got to go through this whole, machination again to get to another budget deal. I think the most likely outcome is we get a deal similar to this one. Another 2-year deal, then the budget caps are done after FY21.
And when would you see that deal being made? Early or?
Nope. No, I mean, Congress is not going to act any sooner than they have to. And so, yeah, it's going to be probably a year and a half from now before they get serious about that budget deal. But, it'll happen. It's happened every year since the BCA was enacted. We've eventually gotten a budget deal of some kind that have raised the caps. So I'm confident it'll happen again. And this deal kind of reset the baseline for a future deal because it was so much of an increase. So now you've got to increase at least that much or else it's going to be a cut. The other dirty little secret we don't talk about is, like Mackenzie said, this is not a real buildup. Even though the budget's going up, the force is not getting larger, not in any significant way. The dirty little secret people don't like to talk about is that if you want to just maintain the same size force we have today in the military, you need the budget to grow at about 3% above inflation year after year after year. That's because of all of our personnel costs are growing, healthcare costs, our O&M costs, our operation and maintenance costs are just keep growing year after year. So just to break even, just to stay where we are, you're going to need sustained growth. So when I look at this budget request and this FIDEP shows that it really only grows with inflation over the FIDEP, I look at that and say, that's a declining force structure. That's a force that's getting smaller over time, or else we're going to be taking risk with things like acquisitions and, research and development or readiness. So, I think that there's a difficult story here. I wouldn't call this a buildup at all. It is certainly nothing like the Reagan buildup.
Okay. Anything we we didn't touch on that you want to add in the budget?
Well, we touched on so much. First of all, thank you for having me. As the sort of avowed bipartisan, that usually means I like to disagree with everyone. I think in this case, I actually agree with everyone. I actually also very much agree with Todd's optimism that I think there will be a budget deal for the last 2 years of the sequester caps. But maybe let me build on a little bit of what everybody said. Looking just beyond the top line number. There's, I think, the issue of how we budget that has a big impact. And as Mackenzie was saying, when we get budget deals so late in the year, especially when there's such a big increase, there's issues with the spend down rate. But moreover, I think when we're always budgeting at the very last minute, when we're cutting back, then we're adding on. When we're not growing enough, as Todd just said, we're using that money to backfill readiness issues, modernization issues. And there's this accordion effect with how we're spending. That means that we're not really using the money that we get to build up. It means that we're always sort of trying to fill backlogs. And I think, beyond any issues about what the top line should be, there's a conversation missing in Washington about the sustainability and predictability of defense funding and the importance of that for the strength of the military, for its ability to forecast, for its ability to build up as it needs to. And I think that more than, however great the higher number that we have for this year in the top line is, I think it's the lack of predictability and sustainability, the fact that, I think we're going to be looking at CRs and last minute budget deals, even if they're getting a good top line for the foreseeable future.
About that to all of you. I know we have a budget deal. I know we have a midterm. Does that mean September 30th we'll have our appropriations all done for the first time in whatever? I don't even remember a time.
No.
So any thoughts on what this year might look like? Is it going to be as chaotic? Or
Last time we had a defense appropriation bill passed on time, I believe was FY09. It was just at the beginning, it was during the 2008 election.
Okay.
They finished it up on time and left town. Ever since then, we've had CRs, and they've been getting longer and more frequent.
So CR past the midterms?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just like normal. Why do we even think?
At least 2 or 3 months into the fiscal year, right?
Yeah.
It's now. I think we can't consider it a long CR until it extends into January.
March, an Easter CR?
Yeah, the March timeframe. That's when it's becoming really bad.
But do you see this? Do you see the budget deal sticking? I mean, is there any risk that things get thrown out?
No.
Okay. That's good news.
That is good news.
Yeah.
No one wants to relitigate this.
Right.
This took a lot.
It's hard enough to get
Yeah.
in the first place. Yep.
Well, let's jump to NDAA. That's been moving along relatively smoothly. Things are, on pace. But any thoughts if this is going to get thrown into a mess because of a Chinese telecom company? Or I guess we could be even dealing with immigration issues on this. But is there anything that you're seeing in NDAA that would be of interest to our group? But also, what do we think might happen in the whole process? Who wants to go first on this? I'm looking at Mackenzie.
Oh, I would. Okay. No, it is moving relatively smooth. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, the budget deal, right? Once you set the top line, it takes that typically is where the fights start, right? And that's where the disagreements are fundamentally, and then they trickle down under that umbrella. So we've removed that off the table. It's completed, thankfully, and it was hard enough to get, so they're not going to undo it, as Todd just said to your question. So that's the good news, and that has held back. But there's also not a lot of controversial social or other policies this year, whether that's transgender or women in combat or whatever your issue is. Torture, detention, the things that really animate ideology on either side of the aisle. There just isn't a lot of that. Some of the most controversial items in this year's defense policy bill have been familiar to you guys based on your speakers in the video. Some of the Fourth Estate reforms proposed by the House in particular. Some of the policy changes in OSD on the Senate side, which is a little below the radar, I think, for a lot of people. But anyway, those are the sort of inside baseball changes that, I mean, they certainly have impact beyond Washington. But those are the fights, if you will. And I don't think...
Anyone else, do we think this will be an easy conference? We'll have a bill by the end of the summer?
Probably. But one of the things that I think is really relevant for this audience is on the House NDA, you have Section 2812, which is another infrastructure capacity study that has a very interesting aspect that could disrupt every single community here represented. It calls for DoD to list surplus or deficits per installation inside the continent of the United States. This would be very disruptive in a myriad of ways that people can imagine. Like you can see that if a community gets listed as having a deficit or surplus, you have immediate effects in the real estate there because maybe people don't want to offer loans because the base might be downsized. You just assume that might have a BRAC-like action, but without having an actual BRAC in place where the Office of Economic Adjustment could step in place or there's an actual overall plan. This study that the House NDA calls, if done in the way that the law lists, would be incredibly disruptive both for DoD and for the communities. And it would be due in the FY21 budget. Okay. So that's something that you guys should be looking at to see if it comes out of conference with that provision or not. And it's not in the Senate version of the NDA, it's only on the House version of it.
I know there was some discussion about that, but I think that is a great point to bring out. Either of you two thoughts on NDAA or?
Yeah, not a lot.
Yeah, well, let's mention something connected to that. Fourth estate. I think a lot of people here didn't even know that term until a few months ago, because it's one of these DC things that people don't talk about. Then suddenly we're all talking fourth estate. We were kind of touched by it because of our connection with the Office of Economic Adjustment. But what do we think on this? I know the chairman has issues, but the Pentagon has also talked that there could be some support. Do we see this as a big reform effort? Is it going to be painful? Or do we think it might kind of peter out?
I think it's going to be a big issue for some time. I think there is kind of a general agreement that, we need to make some reductions here in the size of the fourth estate. I don't think there's a lot of agreement, though, just below that of what exactly do we need to be reducing, what is excess, what is redundant, and so that's got to be worked out. And so I think, Deputy Secretary Shanahan is really laser focused on these kind of management efficiency reforms, but he's doing it internally. I think Congress is trying to do it externally. This is going to have to get worked out over the next few years, but I think there's something here. There's something, there are big things, big changes that are going to happen one way or the other.
Yeah, this is it's perceived as the overdue area of reform, meaning, so the active duty force took their reductions and swallowed that bitter pill, and the civilian defense workforce and the civilian defense contracting workforce did not similarly decline as they did in the 1990s when both came down, or all three workforces came down sort of in tandem, relatively and proportionally. So that's right. So this is not going to be a one-year effort. This is going to be a multi-year effort, but the details are wildly up in the air. I don't want to say Mr. Thornberry threw spaghetti against the wall, but it really did seem like a blanket proposal, and some of the ideas were pretty short-sighted. I don't know with whom they consulted on these issues. I know a lot of people who think and write and talk about these and weren't. So anyway, so OEA is a perfect example, which shows the staff limitations of understanding of such a small budget and small staff and outsized sort of a force multiplying impact office. It was just an obviously stupid idea. And I don't say that lightly. So, and of course he backtracked from it after getting some heat, as he should. So, this is a multi-year reform effort. Yeah. Secretary Shanahan and the CMO, the Chief Management Officer, whom you guys heard from, I know, they're going to be responsible for either trying to get in front of Congress to show continuous action on their own, or you're going to continue to see reforms of the type proposed by Mr. Thornberry this year. I will say, depending on the outcome in the Senate, next year, who has the gavel, whether that's a Republican or a Democrat or a different person altogether, that will affect these questions to some extent, but not dramatically.
Do you think this will continue to be, Congress will take a back seat on this and trust the department? Or do you think each year we'll see spaghetti on the wall kind of guiding them along the way?
If Congress is, if Secretary Shanahan can sell that he is giving them what they want proactively, then I think they'll let him go wild. Okay. And as Todd said, that's pretty much his unilateral focus, which is unique for a deputy secretary. The different deputies, different personalities, different portfolios.
And if I can just make one prediction. So Fred mentioned that Shanahan had talked about the FY20 budget request as being the masterpiece. Most of us, think, oh, the masterpiece budget, right? It's going to somehow magically balance, force structure and readiness and modernization, right? My interpretation, I don't think that's what he meant. I think when he said it's the masterpiece, it's going to have a lot of these management efficiency reforms in it. It's going to do stuff on the fourth estate. I think that's what he views as being the masterpiece budget request. That's a prediction.
So,
we'll wait and see.
I think that there are too many eyes on the fourth estate for nothing to happen. And you see both Shanahan focusing on that even before there was any discussion in Congress through the reform management groups, that honestly, you haven't seen too much output of it, and I assume that on the FY20 budget, you are going to see some of the ideas and outputs that those reform management groups are working on 9 different areas, and they're all cross-function teams and all that good stuff. But the important thing that I see from the congressional discussion is that you're shining a light on a budget that has substantially increased when you see the defense-wide budget compared to the other departments. And one important thing that I think is really interesting from the Thornberry proposal is that you are trying to empower the CMO to actually take more control and take responsibility. And with that comes congressional accountability. So you would have a point person to get dragged into the committee to answer questions. And I think that would be a good point for congressional involvement in a more thoughtful way rather than just seeing what sticks.
And do you think that's going to be the CMO versus Shanahan? I mean, is it unclear yet who's the...
It's probably going to be both.
Okay. Blaise, any thoughts on this?
I think we covered it.
Let's talk a little about something we always touch on here and used to be tied in with NDA, BRAC. It's on a vacation this year. Rumor has BRAC's hanging out at Tropical Island for the year, chilling until it comes back. What are your thoughts in the out years? And I know it's tough because it's very kind of far thinking, but do you think it's gone? Do you think it'll come roaring back? We'll kind of go down. I think all of you might have some thoughts on this. So maybe Todd will start and we'll just run down the panel.
It's never going to be gone forever. At some point, it's coming back up. There are still, areas where we need to rebalance our infrastructure. And so that's got to happen somehow. There's got to be some major changes at some point. That's got to be through a BRAC. So it's going to come back eventually. I think it may wait, though, until it really sinks in Washington that this increase in the budget is not an increase in force structure. That there's not going to be a significant growth in the size of the force. And then you look out into the mid-2020s at the overall federal budget picture, it's not good. We're going to have soaring deficits, and folks are going to start looking for ways to save money again. And so I think BRAC's going to come back up. But yeah, it's probably on vacation for a few years.
Okay.
That's right. There's always the long shadow, right? But it's a different time than all of the previous years. I think we've been up here, especially the two of us, talking about this issue for a variety of reasons. One of them is partly this budget cash infusion. There is some force growth, some end strength growth in the active duty force in particular. And the moment that trajectory stopped its decline and the force began to grow again since depending on which service we're talking about, they've been reducing since the 2008-9 timeframe for the Air Force and the Navy, for example. But there's now concern that the cuts went too far. So, there's even some concern about readiness and the linkage of end strength cuts like ship collisions. And why don't we sailors know how to drive ships anymore? Well, maybe we don't have enough of them and the work weeks are too long because we don't have enough of them. There's a lot of different reasons, of course, but there's a readiness concern here. And once the force starts growing again, many members who don't think about this all the time get very skittish about taking options off the table. But by options, I mean infrastructure in this case. Even if the growth is modest relative to the post 9/11 growth, for example. So that's one issue. Members are going to have to see what the next budget deal is, I think, before they'd be even comfortable signing up for this. One. Two, the Pentagon and Congress are in a loop right now on the BRAC data question. So I read this fascinating, only a nerd could love, GAO report on this issue a month ago that they just put out, basically where Congress said, hey, we need an updated report on the excess infrastructure, and the Pentagon came back and said, hey, we can't give you that report until you give us a BRAC, so then we know how much excess infrastructure we have. So there's a standoff, if you will. But Congress is going to be hesitant to make the choice, absent the data, that the department says we can't get to the data without a commission and a staff standing up that can go find that information out. And I think both sides have a point. So I don't know how that gets resolved, but it certainly helps forestall another BRAC round. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that Secretary Mattis did testify in October that he sees about a 20% surplus. So there is some thinking along those lines within the department of maybe trying to push the needle a little bit. But I agree with Mackenzie that as there's expectations for some potential growth in the force, maybe we're going to have a space force which is going to need its own bases and installations.
We'll get to that.
maybe we're going to have 20,000 troops coming back home from Korea. I don't know. I mean, I think there's going to be enough fluctuation or at least unpredictability in what our infrastructure and basic needs are going to be in the future that I think we're going to hold off for a while to have better clarity before Congress is going to want to move forward with another BRAC.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the discussion is going to renew itself on January 30th, 2019.
Okay.
Specific date.
And that's very specific because there is a reporting requirement on the Senate NEA report based on the GAO report for DOD to update its infrastructure capacity study. And the dispute now is on the baseline that you use to assess what is the actual infrastructure that you need to house the force that you have. And there are two different aspects that are discussed on the NDAA report about BRAC, and one is on that baseline, and the other one is enforcing a new infrastructure report. And there are two important things to think about as well when you're talking about the BRAC discussion. One is that the National Defense Strategy mentions the importance of base realignment and closure process, and that the department would provide Congress with alternatives and process. And if you have that line in the National Defense Strategy, you can rest assured that the department will feel empowered to present Congress with alternatives, or at least to try to negotiate a way out of the current problem. And one of the reform management groups is dealing with real property, and I expect their output to be tied in how to do better real estate management, or however they decide to discuss occupancy within DoD installations. I think that discussion is still going to take place in the next budget discussion that we have in Congress. I don't know how robust or how interested members are going to be in that, but I expect the department to be making the case for better real estate management.
Yeah, we've had some ideas pop up, including one of communities volunteering their bases to be closed, and we didn't really see that going anywhere, so that didn't move forward in the same way. Let's talk about the National Defense Strategy. I can't remember previous ones that much because I think they would come out and they were quickly put on the shelf. This seems to be driving things, but I want to get your opinion. Is this strategy playing out? Is it changing decision making? Is it really at the core of everything that's happening at the department? I'm not sure who would be interested in taking that. Mackenzie, you want to start?
I'll start, sure. It is significant because it's a fundamental shift in the stated public threat priority list for the department. It's not that it de-emphasizes terrorism, the counterterror grind, the forever war, as some call it, but that it puts front and center peer competition with China and Russia, which is quite stark and unique from, I'd say, the last 2 decades of defense strategy. There's little pushback, though, which means that there's actually a relative consensus. Capitol Hill and the members who think about national security regularly, in the broadest sense, endorse the strategy. And that's pretty unique. Usually the two are at odds. So the department and Congress are in big picture sense. They're working together on this. What's happening underneath that in terms of investments, and that's exactly the question I've been looking at in my own budget analysis, is the 2019 budget buying the new strategy? The answer is really not yet, and that's not unreasonable, right? Because it came out about 2 months before the budget dropped, and it would have been unreasonable to expect a dramatic influence. However, some of the departments sort of queued it up as a possibility. But what you're seeing, and what we can look forward to the next budget that's a half a year away and know already what's ahead and how does the strategy translate into that budget. Senior leaders are pretty open in talking about what it means to return to peer competition with China and Russia as the priority for the department. That means basically new investments and new dollars, of which, as Todd eloquently outlined, how hard it is to get to those new dollars with the internal cost growth of the accounts. But when there is new money, it's going to what the department calls capability and not to capacity. So I started there in my opening remarks, and Todd echoed it. The force isn't growing substantially, including the people and the capital assets with this new money. So when I say capability in this sense, it's in the competition of Russia and China space, and that tends to mean long-term research and development investments for the department. There's a lot of short-term programs too, but that's where the new money is going, and that's how it's trickling down.
Thoughts on this, Todd?
Yeah, when I read the National Defense Strategy when it came out, my first thought was there's a lot more continuity here than there is change. And the biggest changes are that it's more forcefully worded in some places. It's still got the big four threats. Russia, China is, kind of your near peer, whatever the word is we were going to use now, competitors. And then you got the rogue nation threats, Iran, North Korea, and then this counterterrorism stuff is like kind of buried down in there. So I didn't expect to see a lot of change in the program and the types of systems we're buying and force structure because it was a continuation of the previous administration's strategy. And so we aren't seeing a lot of change like that. What we are seeing is a boost in funding, and that's just getting consumed by things like readiness that you can't keep on a shelf. So I don't know that we're going to have a much different force to show for this in the end.
Thoughts, Fred?
Yeah, also, on the risk of sounding like a broken record, there is also another reporting requirement in the Senate NDA on the roles and missions of DoD. So the whole thrust of the question that the Senate is asking is, how are you implementing the National Defense Strategy down to the mission of each service? There is even one question of, what is the pacing threat of each military service? And that is also due with the FY20 budget. That's even more reason for you to think of the FY20 budget as a masterpiece. If that provision stays in conference, DoD is going to have to provide some answer. I don't know how disruptive it would be for them to provide an answer. Hopefully, internally, they are doing that homework and they are getting better understanding of what is the role of the Special Operations Force within counterterrorism. What are the Marines doing in the broader context of near-peer competition? All those questions arise from the National Defense Strategy, and the Senate wants to see DoD's homework of how it's implementing the National Defense Strategy. It is a fair question. I think that the way it's worded now goes a bit too deep and too many details that might be left to the department to deal with it by itself. But it is a valid question of how are you actually implementing that strategy? And that answer should be in the FY20 budget request.
Or at least the beginning of it.
Yes.
Blaise, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I do think that you've seen some movement around the edges on the backing away from as much of a focus on the counterterrorism strategy. You've seen SOCOM trying to draw down its presence in Africa. You've seen the president talking about we need to get out of Syria. So I think there's at least a sense that some of the resources we've been committing to the war on terror need to be at least brought back to the homeland, if not redeployed in other capacities. I don't think there's been a lot of thought given to how we redeploy them. And there's a question of how our foreign policy sort of coordinates with and plugs into the national defense strategy. I'd say broadly speaking, the Obama administration was going to have a pivot to Asia that I think was in many ways similar in concept to we need to be thinking about how we compete with China, and that got overtaken by events. I think we can very much see that happen here. It's one thing to have a strategy, right? But as Mike Tyson says, that goes out the window when you get punched in the face. So the next thing that happens, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Africa, whether it's somewhere in Europe, could really define what we are doing for the next several years more than the National Defense Strategy.
Let me ask you a part of that, and you guys can talk on other parts of this, but the whole concept of lethality, it wasn't something we used often and talked about it, and I think communities are trying to figure out how do they kind of connect the dots and talk about their community and their base being lethal, which doesn't always work at the local level, and I think it's hard to understand. So can you guys help us maybe what you see that meaning and how that's really playing out? Any thoughts?
All right, I'm just going to be very direct here. It's a buzzword. Readiness and lethality is nothing more than a buzzword. It's crass. It's offensive to many people when you talk about lethality like this, that's the job of the military, is just to kill people and break their stuff. I think the military does a lot more than that, and I think that Mattis is selling the military short by overly focusing on that word lethality, and I think it's going to undermine a lot of what he wants to do. It is no different than in the last administration. Innovation became this buzzword, and third offset strategy became a buzzword, and it cheapens it to the point that whatever they're trying to accomplish, it ends up backfiring. I recently read, I guess it was a few months ago, I read a press release from the Air Force where they talked about how they had a 100% promotion rate. I forget the ranks it was from, like 04 to 05, and they said that the reason for this was to improve the readiness and lethality of the force. So you promoted people that normally wouldn't be promoted, and that's improving lethality? Like, they're just throwing buzzwords in here. So I'm trying to disregard it because it gets my blood boiling when I hear it.
Thoughts, Mackenzie?
I'm not much more positive, okay. But let me give you my version of the insight into the term. That's right. It's a focus on, frankly, more efficient and better, faster ways to kill people, which is only half of the U.S. military's mission, right? Mm-hmm. The best wars are the ones we don't fight. Their actual primary job is to prevent the bad stuff from happening and needing to kill people in the first place. So I totally agree that it's wildly short-sighted. But this is I would argue this is an exposure of the civil-military divide in Washington, and a challenge that you have when you put a senior uniformed former combatant commander as Secretary of Defense. This is a Marine Corps specific term. Right, so the rest of us, I've written about lethality, and I've called it Secretary Mattis's quest for the white whale anyway, because he has never defined it. He's never put it in a memo, official or even leaked, public or not public guidance to the department. So right now, it really just is his commander's intent to the force, and it's subject and open to interpretation among the services, and each one of them are interpreting it differently. I tweeted, I think Todd saw it and liked it too, when Secretary Mattis testified to pile on that the department moving to the cloud was representative of lethality. I said all hope was lost for the term. Yeah. I understood he actually really could draw the lines in a Shanahan way. Reform makes us more lethal because we're dragging less on the back end, more tooth, less tail. I understand what he was getting at, but it really did sound a little ridiculous at the time. So I would
take it with a grain of salt.
Take it with a grain of salt. Yeah. Understand what it is, but I can tell you what it is not, and this is where it gets unfortunate. Is the term I would have used is modernization. That would have been, the priority for this department, conventional nuclear modernization. If you look at the budget trend since 2001, that's where the money probably needs to go. But this is really, where does this ultimately wind up, even though it lacks definition? Goes right back into the pots of money I talked about earlier, which is capability.
Yeah, both of you at the end.
I think Mackenzie mentioned sort of tooth tail. That's sort of the way I maybe have interpreted what he meant by lethality, or at least the way it could be interpreted, which could link back to the conversation that we were having about the fourth estate. And if it is sort of at least interpreted in Congress as a concern about the efficiency of the force, or at least how much we're investing in the actual deployable force and the people who are going out there and doing stuff versus the back end and support here at home, then you could see sort of the concern for lethality merging with the concern for reforms of the fourth estate, and you could see a convergence there. But again, it's not clear where it's going to go and what it's actually going to end up meaning.
Yeah, I mostly agree with what people are saying. If you use lethality to justify whatever action you're trying to take, it becomes meaningless. if even moving to the cloud or becomes an enhancement of lethality, then you're not just not defining your terms, but you're making it useless.
Well, let's jump from lethality to the midterm elections.
That's a
And I have no linkage between the two to try to
Maybe,
talk about that.
yeah.
So, that's the next big event that we're all kind of watching. Do any of you want to kind of talk through what could play out and kind of, I guess it's scenario based at this point, and what you're kind of thinking and where, like when we're sitting here next year, what could we be dealing with? So I don't know who wants to take that first. I'll volunteer someone. So
I mean, I would say that, yeah, there's, it looks like, according to polling and everything, there's a reasonable chance that the House may flip. Less likely that the Senate would flip, but we'll see. At the end of the day, I'll be a contrarian here. I don't know that it has that much consequence. We often oversell some of this because ultimately, for anything big to pass, to get through, you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate anyway. So a few votes here and there, yeah, it'll change the process, it'll change kind of the character and the shape of things, but bottom line, things like the defense budget, getting a budget deal for FY20, I don't know that it's really going to change that very much. And the one thing it may do is make it more difficult for Congress to work with the White House. But in terms of what legislation gets through, it's already so constrained.
thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the most likely outcome is the House flips, and that's why you're seeing dramatic Republican retirement announcements, including the Speaker, ahead of November, which is unusual. And I don't think this kids in cages at the border scenario is very good for the Republican Party. But what's the most likely impact if that does happen? Well, we already know the biggest issue they're going to face next year, Congress as a whole, regardless, is the 2021 budget deal, right? Because everybody wants it and needs it. It's not just a defense community issue specific. That only just gets more difficult if there's, well, I don't know, it already was pretty difficult this past time to get there, as evidenced by the time it took, although the money makes it look, exactly.
That was hard.
Exactly. So it's not that they won't get there, because everybody actually does ultimately want to get to some kind of deal. It's that the number would be what changes, right? And I think you would see a split the baby approach under divided government. By that, I mean a smaller
do you think
amount.
a Democrat-controlled House could dramatically change that number in DOD, or is it such a big thing that they're not going to be able to pivot that much at that point?
They can change the total amount. They're not going to change the outcome that there is no deal. I see no scenario where there's a return to sequestration.
Right.
Because truly, I mean, that's
No
a
one wants
bipartisan.
that.
Nobody wants
Okay.
it. And, the rising tide lifts all the boats, all the discretionary votes, including non-defense. So, but what would change, and Adam Smith, the ranking member, has been very clear about this, is the number. It would be significantly less than the 80 or so billion increase, give or take, in 18 and 19. It would be closer to 40 or 45 because
Right.
he's very focused on the recent tax bill and the impact on the debt and deficits as a result of that. I know when I testified before the SASC earlier this year, every other question from the Democratic senators behind the dais was about taxes. And we were
Interesting.
testifying on the National Defense Strategy. So there's a sensitivity to that is going to have negative consequences for defense and non-defense down the road.
I'll jump down to the conservative side to say, what do you see potentially playing out?
What I think is going to happen is that it has the possibility of changing the characters that they're playing the game. That's about it. But even within the chairmanships that you have, you might see changes even if the Republicans hold the Senate. But the interesting thing that I see is that there is a joint committee, I forgot the proper name, there's a budget process reform committee that is working now, and its report is due just after the midterms. So depending on how the election shakes out and what is the message that the Republicans get from the election, you could see a push for budget process reform in the lame duck session. I know it's a very unlikely thing to happen, But if you want to remain hopeful about changing the way we do budgets, this would be your shot to the moon. You're probably not going to get away from DC, but it is a good chance to start talking about budget process reform. Because like it or not, the results that we've had in the past 40 years do not paint a pretty picture for the current budget process that we have. So we have an opportunity now to take a look at how we do things. I don't know if there are a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of ideas floating other than changing when the fiscal year ends or doing 2-year budgets, which are just Band-Aids on the process itself. But it is an opportunity that is going to be available. I don't know if anyone is going to.
Solution, just change the date.
Yeah.
We did it before.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, 1974, they passed a bill. It changed the start of the fiscal year from July 1st
they
to
could never
October
get to
1st. And for a while it worked. We started getting appropriations passed pretty close to the start of the fiscal year. But over the past 10, 11 years, that's broken down again. But you can't keep moving the goalpost, changing the start of the fiscal year indefinitely. So
let me add a couple of things to that. I do think that who is in the chairman and ranking positions is important, but I think what's also going to be important coming out of these midterms is the actual composition of each party, because I think there's sort of a struggle about what each party stands for at this point and what the dominant factions are going to be. And I think the narratives you're seeing emerge out of the midterms, at least, is that if you're a critic of President Trump on the Republican side and you haven't already announced you're retiring, you're probably going to be retired. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out and what that means for maybe the traditional sort of deficit hawk wing of the party. And on the Democrat side, I think there's also a question of how the party is going to take shape and what its relationship with President Trump is going to be like after the midterm. As a bipartisan advocate and an eternal optimist, I think there's actually a possibility of a very constructive relationship between a Democratic-controlled House and President Trump, and maybe President Trump returning to some of his earlier rhetoric around the campaign and right before he took the White House on looking at spending on infrastructure, looking at some domestic spending that's going to resonate with and potentially build some possibility for cooperation with Democrats in Congress. And I'd add to this that the context for these discussions is going to be the 2020 presidential election, and it's going to be the fallout, if there is one, of a trade war that we might or might not be embarking on at this moment. And I think whatever the budget deal is going to be looking at 2021, it's going to be based on what are the dislocations to major constituencies of each party from a trade war looking at the presidential election. And so I think you're going to have President Trump a lot more focused on domestic spending maybe and trying to shore up some of his constituencies, whether that's farming communities or others, through domestic spending. And that might mean that defense spending maybe not gets a short shrift, but doesn't get as much of a bump up as we might like to see.
Isn't that exciting to think this time next year we'll be talking about the presidential election already?
Can't wait. Bring it on.
Let me jump to an issue that popped up this week, and we were talking backstage a little about it, but the Space Command. It was kind of happening in real time. We had the Secretary of Air Force here. There was a lot kind of going on that afternoon. Tell us what you kind of, I know none of us really know that much about this, but give us some context and where you think this might play out. And I forget who was. Do you want to start? Because you think you were. You love Space Command.
Right. Well, so first of all, Space Command is different than a Space Force. Space Command would be on the operational side. Right. Like we used to have U.S. Space Command, and then it got subsumed under STRATCOM, and so there's talk now about elevating that out. That's different. This debate over having a separate military service for space, I think it's sprung up on a lot of people, and they immediately think like, oh, Space Marines and lasers and pew pew. No, nothing like that. Right? Okay. This is actually something serious that's been debated within the Air Force and within the military space community for about 2 decades. You can go all the way back to the Rumsfeld Space Commission report from January 2001. it recommended that we gradually transition to an independent service for space. So there's a lot of serious thought that's been put into this, and there's been other commissions that have studied it since then. And of course, last year, Representative Rogers put it into the House version of the NDAA. It passed the full House. Let's consider that for a second. Creating a separate Space Corps, a separate service that would still be under the Department of the Air Force, passed the House of Representatives last year. It did not pass the Senate, and what they ended up in the compromise in the NDAA was to study it and develop a roadmap to create something like this in the future. Now, President Trump has jumped on this issue, and this week wasn't the first time he said it. Right. He said it publicly several times before. So, what does it mean going forward? I think that, my personal opinion, this is inevitable that we are eventually going to get a separate military service for space. And it's going to become necessary because of our military's increasing dependence on space for operations here on Earth. Yes, it's all robotic. It's all remotely operated. There are no people operating in any of these national security space systems. But nevertheless, it is a warfighting domain. It's increasingly important. And more importantly, our adversaries recognize this as an increasingly important domain of modern warfare. In 2015, both China and Russia reorganized their own space forces to raise their prominence within their own military. It doesn't translate directly over in terms of like a military service or a department because the constructs are just different in different countries. But other countries have been looking at this. It's something we've got to look at seriously. And I think the real question is, what is the scope of this Space Force? What all does it include? Does it just carve out Air Force Space Command and bring it over? I think that would be too little. I think you also need to go and carve out the space-related organizations in the Navy, like PEO for Space out in San Diego, part of the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command. And then there's a big question of what do you do about the intelligence agencies and their space components? What do you do with the National Reconnaissance Office? Do you bring that into it as well? You can do this within existing resources. You don't need any new bases or anything like that because we already have space forces in our military. This is just about realigning them under one unified chain of command and raising the prominence of space to be on par with the other physical domains of modern warfare. So how do you carve it out? And then there's the timing, the transition. You can't do it quickly. First of all, it will require Congress to legislate this, so that doesn't happen quickly. But even then, you need a gradual transition plan to build to this. You shouldn't try to do it overnight.
Any of you on this?
Yeah, let me maybe relate this to a previous conversation we're having and maybe to how it might impact defense communities. If we were talking about lethality before, if lethality means we need more trigger pullers, then it is out of line with what we're seeing actually being focused on in the force, which is we need capabilities in space. We're building up Cyber Command as its own unified command, separating it out. And there's a much more focus on these technical fields, right? And so, there's this disconnect between the technical and the lethality conversations that are happening in the military. But that connects to questions that are being thought through in the services and in Congress about personnel recruitment and retention. And the question of if we are focused increasingly on a force that is going to have expertise in technical fields, that is going to require perhaps different skills and different career paths than traditional military force that we've had before, how should we be changing our personnel policies? And I think what you're seeing them realize is that we're not well suited to this right now. If you look at some of our technical fields, like pilots, the Air Force has only 70% of the fighter pilots it projects that it needs, and it's losing more every year. And so you're already seeing the services think about what can we do to make career paths more flexible, more attractive to technical fields. And I think it actually has interesting impacts for defense communities because you're seeing things like maybe some of these service members don't need to move duty stations as much. Maybe they don't need to PCS as much. Maybe they want more predictability in their family lives. And so you're seeing all the services start creating possibility for people to stay in their duty stations longer or at least have longer opt out of switching duty stations quite as often. And you've seen the Senate, at least, in its NDAA start thinking through this as well, letting people opt out of promotions, for example, if they want to remain in the job they're doing right now, starting to think about what would lateral entry look like so that people can come into the force later in their civilian careers. What does a potential sort of break from the force look like so that someone can leave their military career for a time to go get educated or maybe do something else in a civilian field and then come back? And so I think this is going to change the pattern of how people follow military career paths, which could change the pattern of how people interact with the communities in which they live. They could be on base in a community longer, which means that their kids are in school longer. That means greater ties to communities. So I think it's really interesting to think about how a focus on things like Space Force and the technical fields is going to spell out changes in personnel policy, which is in turn going to spell into how personnel and service members interact with communities that they might want to stay in longer.
Great. Did you have any? Well, we are out of time. We've gone from budget to the moon and space marines, which I guess you can own that as your thing. But I want to thank you all for joining us. This is always a favorite of ours to have this group and really give our members a perspective of what's happening around the country. So thank you all for being here today. And if we can give them a thank you from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.